Member for Roe.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Premier, I refer to your answer in question time on Tuesday, where you indicated your support for the National Senate candidate Nick Fardell's plan to establish a military base on the Pilbara coast. And I ask, will the Premier today throw his support behind Big Nick's plan to waive HECS fees for any person willing to live and work in regional WA for 5 years? And does the Premier agree we need to incentivise more city people to live and work in the bush?
Premier.
Mr Speaker, I'm getting asked about Big Nick again. I watched a video of Big Nick consequent to Tuesday's question time, and look, I'm confident he's not going to be elected. Well, I don't know. Have you watched the video? If you watch the video, you'd think that he's not going to be successful. You know,
Pick will get the flick.
Yeah. Well, don't you support the glory? No, he doesn't. Clearly, we've got an anti-glory here. We've got an anti-glory person here in the chamber. Mr Speaker,
Members.
Yeah, he's anti-West Australian. Member for Moore hates Western Australia, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, look, asking me questions in question time about obscure candidates' ideas I've never heard of. I personally think you should ask about more substantial issues. Obviously, I support Bill Shorten and Federal Labor's plans for Western Australia, and if you want to have a look at plans for education, Federal Labor has real plans for education to make sure we properly fund our schools and TAFE colleges across Western Australia, make sure we properly support our universities across Western Australia with substantial increases and improvements which are funded to come towards our schools and indeed our hospitals and TAFE colleges across Western Australia. In terms of people living in regional Western Australia, I strongly support people living in regional Western Australia, and obviously we want to make sure that we have economies across the state that support that. That's why we're very proud that since we've been in office, we as a government have presided over an increase in jobs by 44,000 West Australians in employment, above what was in office last time, above what was in employment last time you were in office.
Supplementary.
Supplementary.
Premier, I do regard regional education as a substantive issue, and I do ask that will the Premier agree to work with Big Nick or whoever is in power in order to make his HECS plan a reality.
Members.
In order to make his plan a reality, regardless of who the Prime Minister is on Saturday night.
Is it Saturday night?
Premier.
Regardless of
What do you say about Saturday night?
regardless of
Look, if Big Nick's elected to the Senate, Mr Speaker, if Big Nick's elected to the Senate, I'm going to walk east.
Careful.
Mr Speaker, I haven't looked at those Senate bet odds on Big Nick, but I suspect they're not good. But obviously, we will always work in the interests of Western Australia to get the best deal for Western Australia that we possibly can, whoever is in power in Canberra. And as I said to you perhaps last week, we have secured more support out of Canberra than any government in living memory. And it was a Liberal National government. So imagine what's going to happen when there's a Labor government in Canberra, Mr Speaker. We'll be working cooperatively to get a better deal for our state. You know, Mr Speaker...
Members.
I work cooperatively with Big Mal. I met Big Barnaby, but I can't say that I had a great deal to do with Big Barnaby. Big Mick, the leader of the National Party, have a cooperative relationship with him, and secured enormous amounts of money from Big Paul, Big Paul Fletcher. Yeah, Big Paul Fletcher. So we have a history of getting more resources for Western Australia out of people in Canberra. But you asked me in an earlier question. About whether we encourage people to live in the bush. I support people living in the bush, and I'd love to see some of the National Party MPs move to the bush. That would be great. If some of you actually went, if some of you moved out,
Leader of the National Party.
If some of you moved out of Mount Lawley,
Member for Perth.
you might actually provide some economic activity out there in the bush. If you moved in the towns you represent, if you actually moved in those towns you represent, went and brought your groceries and brought your milk, bought your motor vehicles, rather than hanging around the inner city latte area, with all due respect to the member for South Perth, maybe you provide more activity out there in your electorate. So my advice to national MPs is move out to your electorates. You might learn something about them, and you might support your local economies.